Lady Beechworth gave a short, "Ha." Those silly people wouldn't know if a snake was sleeping in their beds. No, those are the ones who supported Sir Laurie when he was alive. His death has given them a martyr to back. They want dragons out of England. Anyway, they can. Rain took more notice of the people that glared at the two. She knew some people weren't keen on dragons having any say in the government, but she hadn't realized the feeling had permeated so much of the upper echelons of society. Much of society had their positions of power because of their connections to dragons. It seemed counterproductive to bite the hand that fed them. With that in mind, she said to Lady Beechworth, "I think I might just introduce myself." Chapter 15. The door opened, bathing the empty street with candlelight, and Rain caught her breath. Mains tugged his coat closer around him against the cold night. He glanced around looking for anyone on the streets before he stepped away from his doorstep. Rain peeled out of the small shadows she had been hiding in and followed him as he made his way through the streets of Londinium. She moved from shadow to shadow in case he glanced behind him. She had been following him for 2 nights. Hoping he was the one behind the attacks and that it wasn't someone else that was trying to frame Victor. That would be in the realm of impossible or unlikely. Unfortunately, she didn't have any evidence it was Mains who was the killer or the new dragon attacker that was being reported in the newspapers. Mains moved down the street as if on a mission, giving her hope he was on his way to further blacken Victor's name. It was disappointing when he stopped at a theatre 2 blocks over. She didn't go inside as the lights would make it easier to spot her. Instead, she found a hiding spot in the shadows of a highly decorated building. She had a good view of the entrance and settled in to wait. She almost jumped out of her skin when Victor said just behind her, "Now what is a pretty girl like you doing out in the middle of the night on Londinium streets?" She turned to glare at Victor. "I can ask you the same thing." He patted his hair and said, "I do have nice hair, but I wouldn't go so far as to call me pretty." "Handsome maybe." Rain turned back to watch the theatre. "I don't have time for this, Victor." She had no idea how he had found her and assumed it was another dragon ability she didn't know of. He leaned on the wall next to her, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his body. "Oh, are we on first name basis again?" She almost asked him how he found her, but she dreaded the answer. Besides, it wasn't that important. Instead she said, "Being annoying is not a great way to court someone." "Courting? That is better than where we were before." She glanced over her shoulder and asked, "What are you even doing out?" "I thought you were hiding from the mobs." Funnily enough, when the temperature is low the mob seems to disappear. There was a single diligent bigot at my door this evening and it didn't take much to sneak past him. He still thinks I'm at home and he is standing watch with his pitchfork and torch. She sighed at his dramatic portrayal of the few people who staked out his home. They were mostly annoying rather than dangerous. Changing the subject, she announced, "I met another dragon." He stepped in closer and asked intensely, "Who?" A smile slipped onto her lips for a moment at his obvious jealousy. "Lady Beechworth calls them fixers." He relaxed, taking a step back. "Oh, that is only Harlin." So, she was right, they really are fixers. Rain had spoken with them at the ball. Most people had watched on nervously in case another full-sized dragon happened to transform again in the ballroom. Some had been disappointed when nothing had happened. Maybe she had been invited because of what had happened at the last ball. Harlin had been on his best behavior and had asked questions about her investigation into Eleanor and Sebastian's deaths. They revealed they were more concerned about Victor as a suspect in Sebastian's death than in the more recent death of Sir Laurie. The timeline made more sense as they had arrived almost as the reports in the newspapers had started. They must have already been on their way. She had been frank as possible. Her godfather would have wanted her to be transparent, but a casual comment had revealed that Mains had been keeping them in the dark. That was when she had decided to follow Mains. With the death of the innkeeper, she couldn't use the plate she had taken from the newspaper. But it didn't change the possibility that he had been having a meal with Sebastian just before his death. Or the possibility Sir Laurie had revealed the truth of Eleanor to Mainz, sealing his own fate. Frustratingly, she had nothing tangible to take to Charles. Relaxed, Victor tucked his hands into his pockets. Probably to keep his hands warm, as the temperature at night was chilly at best, but it was clear he wasn't intimidated by the idea of the fixers who were here to investigate him. Yeah, they work for the Emperor, he confirmed for her. She frowned as she glanced at him over her shoulder. She kept her focus on the theater, so it was hard to see his expressions as they spoke. We have an empress at the moment. You dragons really do get out of touch with reality, Rain corrected him. Oh, I meant Emperor. This made her half turn to see if he was serious. He added, the Dragon Emperor. You mean he is still alive? She had heard that William the Conqueror's father was still around. He had been the instigator of the treaty between dragons and humans, mostly to keep his descendants safe. It had heralded a time of peace between dragons and humans in Europe that had allowed them to flourish as a civilization. She had thought he was a myth, almost. Yes, no one has put him out of his misery yet, though I don't see how Harlin puts up with him. He can be so insufferable. Who is Harlin? She didn't mean as a dragon, but rather his position in the organization of dragons. There were certainly gaps in her understanding of the hierarchy. He is the Emperor's brother. Was Lala there? Rain had liked Lala. She had been pleasant and sincere, which made Rain instantly fond of her. Yes. She seemed nice. Victor snorted. To you maybe. She scares the bejeebus out of me. She chuckled at the thought of the woman in the elegant gown scaring a dragon, but he grew serious. She is a dragon hunter. Victor's eyes warmed as he teased her with new information. No. Wait, Lala, that is a Romani name. She snuck another glance back at him. He nodded, agreeing with her deduction. Yes, and the Romani took in the hunters when they were made outlaws. Her mind wandered back to her meeting with Lala. There had been no evidence that she was powerful enough to kill a dragon. But that was the point of dragon hunters, to take out dragons. Rain had thought they were extinct. Dragons had left them out of the treaty, and so they were fair game for any dragon. A dragon hunter. Interesting. I can see why they are sent in to fix things then. Harlin would have the political clout because of his brother, and she would be able to kill any dragon who was trouble, Rain thought out loud. Oh, Harlin has taken out a few of our brethren. Besides, he doesn't play politics. Only his brother does. He has a tendency to stick his nose into places it shouldn't be. Harlin plays a buffer between the Empress and the Emperor. Stops him from interfering too much. The fact that dragons still called him Emperor showed just how successful Harlin had been, but at least the humans hadn't figured out yet that he was playing puppet master. She wasn't sure herself how she felt about that. Do you think he has come for you? She asked, wondering if his calm was because he hadn't gathered that Harlin was here to put Victor out of his misery if he really was a killer. Victor snorted at the idea. No, I think he is here to sort out the newspapers. Good riddance. I have no idea where they have been getting their stories. From what Harlin had been asking, she didn't think he would do anything about the papers. He was playing nice with the authorities, and to get the newspapers sorted would take some draconian measures, pun intended. Most likely from the Yard, she answered honestly. She had been reading the newspapers herself, and there were details about the attacks that were in her reports and nowhere else. Between her and Larkin, the only other person who knew what were in those reports was Mainz. You, his voice not serious as he lightly accused her. I should be insulted. No, I think the killer is an officer and they are framing you. The articles in the newspapers are on purpose. Your trial is being held right now and the jury is the public. She wasn't any more specific. Besides, he would figure it out when he saw who she was following tonight. She still didn't feel confident to accuse a fellow officer of murder when all she had was speculation. Not even circumstantial evidence. That doesn't sound pleasant. His voice more amused than upset over the newspapers. She wasn't so sure he should be so cavalier over the impact of public opinion. Then it is a good thing that your dragon fixer is getting involved. Though if Harlan did try to stop the newspapers, he would only make the situation worse. She didn't think Lala or Harlan were the type to add fire to the situation, so she wasn't really worried that would happen. It would mean that the newspapers would continue to write articles about the vices of dragons and Victor in particular. Victor got speculative over Harlan's presence. Maybe. If he goes with what the Yard tells him, he might think I really did kill Eleanor. Except that the Yard had gone silent on Harlan. Now she saw this could be a good thing, as it had opened up for her to tell Harlan the truth behind the investigation. That particular strategy had certainly backfired on Maines. It sounded like Harlan had been a fixer for the Emperor for a while, so he might have been involved back when Eleanor had died. Curious, she asked, did they not investigate back when she died? Surely there would have been more upset then. Yes and no. I went to Europe and explained myself. They were satisfied when I didn't show any mating marks. He offered his arm to her. Pushing up a sleeve to show his pale skin was clear. Mating marks. She had heard of them, but like with her sister, she liked to play dumb and see what little nuggets of information she might collect from the dragon. Victor didn't disappoint and explained, when dragons get married, they brand each other. If they get divorced, they disappear. The brands disappeared the same time that Eleanor did. She hadn't realized dragons could get divorced. She divorced you. Isn't that difficult? The divorces she had heard of amongst humans was usually drawn out and painful. With all the couple's dirty laundry put on display for everyone who cared to gossip. But then the Ton were not kind to those that didn't manage to achieve the perfection society required. Not for dragons. She made a choice and renounced me, and that was all that was needed. I didn't even need to be there for it. She must have renounced me speaking with someone else, as she never admitted it to me personally. I was blindsided. I went home to find the place almost completely empty. She'd had movers come in and empty it in an afternoon while I was with the governor. Now that was something she hadn't known. Sir Laurie. Her eyes were on the theatre, but her mind was turning over the new information. Eleanor would have known she had cut ties with the dragon as well when her own brand disappeared. Had she waited to be away from Victor to do that, or had she, like Rain, not known about the ease of dragon divorce and divorced him unknowingly? That could have put a wrinkle in the two cons' plans. She still didn't know how Maines played into all of this, but it added a new facet to her investigation. Had Eleanor and Sebastian ended their part of the plan too early? Victor explained more about his relationship with Sir Laurie without her having to do more than a vague prompt. Yeah, we weren't seeing eye to eye, and I was in negotiations with him about changing laws. Wait, laws? She half turned again. More information she hadn't known. It seemed the dragon's influence wasn't just coming from the Emperor of Dragons himself, but all of his people. Yes, my role here is to help guide the humans to a more egalitarian way of life. We can't move too fast or you get upset, so we wheedle and whine until things change. She was going to ask him to explain when the door to the theatre opened and cut off her thought. She frowned. It was way too early for the show to be over. Maines slipped out and closed the door behind him. He looked around but didn't spot them in the shadows. Why now? She asked the heir. Victor answered anyway, his alibi. She swore softly under her breath as she moved to follow Maines. He was up to no good if he needed to make sure that people thought he was at the theatre when whatever he planned went down. Victor skipped to keep up with her as she had surprised him with her sudden movement. He didn't speak, which she appreciated, as they both slipped from shadow to shadow as they followed Maines. Maines didn't travel at a steady pace, instead he stopped occasionally to add or take something away from his outfit. He moved under a street lantern revealing his new appearance. Victor swore. "He looks like me." Victor never kept up with fashion and wore outfits out a few seasons and therefore very distinct. Maines was even wearing the same waistcoat Victor was currently wearing. Maines had also donned a wig to hide his own pale locks to match Victor's much darker hair. Rain had been pretty sure that Maines had been behind the rumors of attacks by Victor, but she hadn't been sure how he had achieved it. She had thought he had merely paid the people to say they were attacked by Victor, but this was even more sinister as those people would swear to their graves it was the dragon who attacked them. She still didn't know his motivations or why he hated dragons. It was curious that he had similar views to dragons as the late Sir Laurie. Maines stopped outside another theatre, forcing them to duck into an alley. They looked around the edge of the building. Maines disappointingly didn't do anything. He just stood there outside of the theatre. She held her breath waiting for him to attack or something. Victor interrupted the tension by asking, "Are we courting?" "We are on an outing." The comment so out of left field that she answered with a snap to her voice. "I'd hardly call this romantic." There was a smile in his voice as he added, "Maybe to others, but this is your passion." She glanced back at him surprised by his insight. She rewarded him by being honest. "I won't ever marry. A husband would require me to give up my work and I don't want that." He didn't seem perturbed by her announcement and instead asked, "But do you still want children?" That was unlikely to ever be one of her choices. "If I could find a man willing to treat me like an equal instead of a broodmare, sure I wouldn't mind having children. I just don't see how they'd fit into my life at the moment." His voice grew deeper as he stated simply, "Acceptable." She frowned at him, not sure what he meant by that. But she had to turn back to Maines who was making his move. Someone had left the theatre a little ahead of everyone else so they were alone. Maines followed them as they headed for the main street where they would be able to call for a hansom cab. Rain tugged on Victor's coat to urge him to follow her as she dashed across the street. She heard the scream and added a little more energy to her step, dragging her skirts up so she could run faster. Victor passed her as he didn't have the impediments of cloth. She muttered a long-worn curse over women's clothing and got to the street in time to see Maines running and Victor crouched over the man. She hesitated at the tableau but Victor called out, "I've got this. Get after him." She saw a flash of blue light as Victor pulled something out of his collection for the injuries the man had suffered. She hitched up her skirts higher but Maines was already gaining distance on her. When her lungs started to burn and Maines ducked down an alley and then out of sight, she stopped chasing him. She wished she could have caught him in the act, but having to live with just knowing she had been right about the attacks reported in the newspapers would have to do. Victor at least was not guilty on this charge. The rest was still up for debate as far as the yard was concerned. She trudged back towards Victor. Her breath still labored. As she approached, she couldn't get anywhere close to Victor or Mains's victim as there was a large crowd. The theatre show must have finished, spilling the crowd onto the street in time to see the attack. Unfortunately, they wouldn't have seen Maines. She tried elbowing her way through but the jeers and the crowd kept her back. Someone shoved her and she landed on her rear. She could have fought the crowd more to get to the victim but it would mean revealing she was a bobby and the feel of the crowd made her weary. Not all peelers were appreciated by the public and she was alone. Victor, as a dragon, could easily escape so she didn't worry about him. Making her way to the edges of the crowd she waited for it to disperse. Instead of dispersing the crowd started to move in a concerted direction. She climbed a short wall to see if she could see the center of the crowd. Her heart dropped when she saw Victor unconscious and dragged between two burly men.